Chapter 1. Moldova, 2023. Sean Wyatt pressed his eye to the scope, watching the Russian mobsters transferring the heavy crates, loading them onto 3 vans disguised with a moving company logo slapped on the side. The rain pouring from the sky helped conceal his position, but also limited visibility. Blessings and curses, he thought. Under the eave of the abandoned mill rooftop, the rain didn't touch him, though he knew soon he'd have to venture out of the nest and into the deluge. His assignment was simple, at least in concept. Kill everyone and destroy the weapons. Easy enough, if it was a video game. In practice, the mission was a little more complicated than that. A lot more. By his count, there were 24 men moving the crates, both by hand and with a forklift. They were all armed with pistols or submachine guns, the latter a combination of Heckler and Cokes, and what Sean figured were some Chinese knockoffs. While unreliable, they could still be deadly in the right hands. Or if someone was just lucky. To say Sean was outnumbered was an understatement. But then again, that's how all of these Axis missions were. So he'd been told. This happened to be his first. For an Axis agent, there were no training wheels missions, no easing into things. It was a pure baptism by fire with a lava frosting on top. He and the other 11 agents operated alone, independent of each other, and without knowledge of what any of the others were doing in their respective missions. At least that's how it usually went. This one was an experiment, a trial run in a way. Sean wasn't sure he wanted to be a guinea pig, but he didn't get to make the rules. The reason Axis agents worked alone was simple. Plausible deniability was paramount for an agency that reported directly to the President of the United States, and in turn, the Commander-in-Chief reported to no one regarding Axis missions. Other than that, they received no intel, no details, and minimal debriefing. With such tight security measures, Axis operatives were protected from enemies both foreign and domestic. The military top brass presented the President with problems, and then he took those problems to Axis. Underneath all that simplicity, however, was a delicately operated machine. And Sean was one of the cogs. The agency had been formed as a direct response following the attack on Pearl Harbor, just as Black Cell had been formed to similarly address terrorism or covert attacks on the United States. Axis was designed to be a way to intercept such dangerous attacks before they happened, and to eliminate serious national security threats, both to the U.S. and its allies. The shroud of secrecy around Axis kept the media and the population from accusing the nation of activities that bordered on state-sponsored terrorism, which it wasn't, but sometimes to keep the hands of the people clean, the hands of the government had to get dirty. Every agent knew the score. Get captured in the field, you die with everything you know. For most, they accepted this burden because they didn't have much else in life. No family, few if any friends. Sean, however, was different. His parents were still alive and in good health. If he disappeared, it would devastate them, but after he'd been approached to join Axis, he felt called to the task as if it was destiny. He continued to watch the men loading the trucks. According to his intel, they would be moving out in an hour, as soon as all of the cargo was loaded. If the trucks got out, there was no way Sean could stop them all. Each of the moving vans was designated for a different destination, but every one of them had something in common. The buyer. Sean's intel said a terrorist organization known as Blood Moon had set up the buy, and the weapons distributed would provide extremist cells in major cities all over Europe with the capability to cause mass carnage. Their plan, as Sean understood it, was to arm their soldiers and send them into public places such as train stations, malls, outdoor markets, locations where thousands of people congregated at once. Armed to the teeth, these terrorists could wreak havoc, cause chaos, and result in tighter control by governments, removing freedoms from their people in the name of public safety. Sean's job was to disarm all of them before they ever got the weapons, leaving the cells essentially naked. He knew if he was successful, it would buy the cooperating agencies much-needed time to track down the individual cells before they could find another arms dealer. Failure wouldn't just mean his death, but the deaths of thousands, perhaps more. Such attacks often bred copycats. If one organization claimed responsibility, others would follow. The task weighed heavy in Sean's mind. The lives of untold thousands were counting on him, and they didn't even know it. He'd studied the facility intensely before arriving on the scene. Sean knew every way in and out of the old building, unless there were some kind of secret passages that had been constructed after the original design. He doubted the current tenants would have constructed such modifications, but you could never really know. Sean brushed off the doubt-filled paranoia. He returned the binoculars to his gear bag and rechecked the extra magazines in his vest and on his belt. The chilly rain didn't pierce Sean's watertight shell jacket and pants, but beads of cold moisture rolled down his forehead and off his face. He'd been trained to ignore such elements, things he couldn't control. Always focus on the things you can control, he learned in his training. That mantra was one of the big reasons Sean played poker. Luck was an element he couldn't control, but in poker there were key decisions to be made, all based on math, psychology, and logic that could make or break a person's session or career. The stakes had never been higher than they were at this moment, although the same could be said of most Axis missions. Staring through the scope, he considered taking out the men one at a time, but he knew that wouldn't work. He could eliminate one or two, three maybe, if he was lucky. But the second the first guy went down, all the others would be spooked. More importantly, the main target, the man running the show, would get away. The elusive Vladimir Pushnaya had managed to slip through the fingers of Interpol and the CIA more times than they could count. It wasn't as if the man kept a low profile. He could be found. It was just a matter of knowing where and when. Sean originally discovered the man at a gentleman's club in Moscow more than 3 weeks before. Utilizing a combination of tracking tech and a series of contacts, Sean managed to follow Pushnaya through Europe, bouncing from Russia to Poland, Romania, Hungary, and eventually here to Moldova. The former Soviet state provided excellent cover for shady underground dealings for men like Pushnaya. Being a relatively small, obscure nation, Moldova was easily overlooked by most international law enforcement agencies or defense ministries. Home to many vineyards and wineries, the Moldovan citizens also didn't recognize the many corrupt dealings happening right under their noses. They were too busy working, producing some of the world's best red wines. On top of that, their economy was finally beginning to click, and people across the country were discovering newfound economic freedom, along with the ability to enjoy some of their traditional cultural pleasantries. Things that were taken for granted in other parts of the world, such as sitting down with friends for a cup of coffee, were now the center of a day's activities. Sean found that the Moldovan people appreciated the little things much more than folks back in the States, a fact that saddened Sean to a degree. Now, he had Pushnaya cornered. Sean had been waiting for the right time to make a move and take the man down, along with his entire operation. This seemed like the perfect opportunity. He straightened up onto his knees and looped his pack over the left shoulder. Clutching the rifle to his chest, Sean retreated farther into the shadows and through the open window he'd used to gain access to the rooftop. Sean climbed down a rickety ladder. The pistols on his hips and outer thighs weighed heavily, but he'd trained hard through the years, and his muscles handled the extra pounds without much trouble. He scurried over to the nearest door. It hung slightly open. There he waited, listening, watching. Rain pounded the tin roof and metal walls. The sound reverberated throughout the enormous mill. It might have annoyed some. Sean liked the sound, and for more than one reason. It enabled him to move faster without fear of being detected. Stopping at the door, he was about to pry it open and dart across the loading yard to a stack of old pallets when he froze. A flashlight panned across the ground nearby. It swiveled to the left, then right, as the person carrying it searched for signs of trouble. Sean bit his lower lip. A patrol guard this far off the perimeter? The thought annoyed him, but it only meant he would have to start dancing a little sooner than planned. He leaned back against the inner wall and waited, watching as the circle of light drew closer to his position. Sean drew a tactical knife from his belt and waited, measuring his breaths in a slow, even rhythm, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 2. The radiant glow of the flashlight neared Sean's hiding spot. The circular light bobbed and swayed past the door. Sean felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. A strange mix of nervous energy and excitement pulsed through his veins. He waited until the man's right arm appeared through the crack. Then Sean pounced. He kicked open the door just as the patrol guard reached out his left hand to pry the door open and check inside. Apparently, his assignment was intended to check the abandoned buildings in case of threats. Had he been more cautious, he might have lived a few more seconds. Maybe. Sean surged forward with the knife, driving the tip of it through the man's throat and up into his skull. The guard gyrated for several seconds, blank eyes staring up into the dark, stormy sky. Then his body went heavy, and Sean withdrew the blood-stained blade and allowed the guard to collapse into a puddle on the concrete. Initially, Sean was annoyed at the guard's presence, but at the sight of the man's radio wire stretching from his ear to a shoulder microphone, his tune changed. He stood over the body for a second as he plucked the radio from the dead man and wiped it off before inserting it into his right ear. Once the mic was attached to a patch of Velcro on his jacket, he picked up the flashlight the guard had dropped and continued on the man's assumed path, walking casually past the front of the abandoned mill until he reached the far corner. There, Sean swept the flashlight around as he figured a patrol guard would do, checking the stacks of pallets and faded, rusted shipping containers. "Come in, Patrol 3. What's your status?" The Russian voice crackled in Sean's ear, and he winced at how loud the dead guard kept the volume. He reached up and switched it down slightly so it wouldn't be so piercing, then waited. Sean understood enough Russian to know what the commander on the radio said, but what he didn't know was whether or not the guard he'd killed was Patrol 3. He received his answer within seconds. "I repeat, Patrol 3, what is your status? What are you doing over there?" Sean pressed a button on the microphone on his shoulder. "All clear. Sweeping back around now," he replied in gruff Russian. He'd learned that when impersonating someone, always use a voice that matched the body type. The man he'd killed had a black beard and multiple tattoos on his neck and hands. He was thick, but muscular, which lent to a deeper, tougher-sounding voice. "Confirmed," the coordinator said. Relieved, Sean turned and strolled across a gravel loading area. From a distance, his ruse would work. He was a wolf walking among sheep. But when he got close enough for them to see that he wasn't the guard they believed him to be, then all hell would break loose. He slowed his pace near a stack of pallets and metal scrap, then stopped. Shining the light to his right, he looped it around to make it look as though he'd heard or seeing something suspicious. The act was one he'd seen from patrols before, both ally and enemy. It bought him precious seconds to look over the loading yard and reassess his approach. There was still no sign of Pushnaya. That came as no surprise. The man wouldn't be out here in the rain, but he was here. Somewhere. Sean knew that much. The Russian boss would be in a building, and if he had to guess, it would be the one in the far corner of the property. The warehouse looked much like the rest of the derelict buildings on site, with one glaring exception. While the windows and doors of most of the structures were dark, having long given up any source of power, dim lights glowed from within several windows at the top of the corner warehouse. In its heyday, the third-story room must have been a supervisor or managerial office. Sean knew that now. It had to be the covert nerve center for Vladimir Pushnaya's black market arms dealings. That realization hit Sean in a couple of ways. The first was irritation. He'd reconnoitered the area multiple times, both from a distance and with satellite images. Not once had he seen anyone coming from or going to the warehouse. The second realization was that now he had a much bigger problem. If Pushnaya was personally overseeing the shipment of weapons to their contacts in the Blood Moon organization from warehouse where the guns had been stored, Sean could execute his original plan of taking out the henchman first, then eliminate the head of the snake. In traditional warfare, the opposite strategy usually worked best. Kill the head and the body dies. While that might work in this scenario, Sean wasn't sure. If he went for the shipment and destroyed the guns, He'd prevent them from being delivered to a known terrorist organization and cripple their plans for mayhem across any number of targets throughout the civilized world. On the other hand, if Sean went straight for Pushnaya, the alarm could be sounded, and the bulk of the weapons already loaded onto the trucks would escape. With no way to track them, the trucks would disappear and Sean would be responsible, potentially, for the deaths of many innocent people. He cursed his luck, but reverted back to his training. If he could track down Pushnaya, he could do it again. While making a move on the weapons trucks would give the Russian boss time to escape, it would momentarily save lives and keep guns out of the hands of evil men. It would also put a dent in Pushnaya's finances, as a deal like this would certainly be worth a small fortune. Terrorists paid well for arms and munitions. Often funded by oil money, they were happy to overpay for weapons, sometimes double what the items were worth. Having a connection with the ability to produce those kinds of products was difficult to forge, though it was getting easier in certain parts of the world. Sean wondered how many people like Pushnaya had to be eliminated before the well ran dry for this kind of operation, but he already knew the answer. There would always be another to take the place of someone like the Russian arms dealer. Wherever there was money to be made, legitimate or otherwise, someone would step in with gleaming dollar signs in their eyes to take the reins. With that in mind, Sean knew what he had to do. If another Pushnaya could pop up tomorrow, at least the new guy would have a shallower product pool to dip into for export. Sean lowered the flashlight, pointing it randomly to his right before killing it. He cast his eyes across the loading area where the forklifts and men hurriedly placed crates on trucks. Sean knew he was running out of time. The decision had been made. Now the question was line of attack. Use a diversion with some of the explosives in his pack, or go in guns blazing? Sean considered both options before he made his decision. Sean shuffled behind one of the pallet stacks and set down his tactical bag. His fingers moved to the zippers at the top, and he quickly peeled open the compartment containing 2 frag grenades and 2 flashbangs. The plan of attack was just formulating in his mind when he felt the presence of someone hovering over him. He'd not heard the footsteps. All the noise from the forklifts and the workers just 30 yards away blocked out any detailed sound from nearby. "What are you doing?" a deep, manly voice asked from behind in Russian. Sean barely turned his head, keeping the hood over the left side of his face to conceal his identity. "I found this," he answered in Russian, motioning to the bag. "It looks like military. Did one of our patrols drop it? Doesn't look like our issue." The shadow draped over Sean's form shifted, and the man came into view on his left. The other guard was easily 5 inches taller than Sean, and probably 30 pounds heavier, with tough, sinewy muscles practically ripping through his tight raincoat. His black beard was perfectly shaped, which Sean figured must have taken the guy way too much time a couple of times a week. The man picked through the contents of the bag, discovering the grenades, full magazines, 2 knives, and a collection of other gadgets. "You don't know who this belongs to?" the man asked. "No," Sean lied. "As I said, I was returning from my patrol and found it." The bearded guard glowered at Sean, though Sean only noticed out of the corner of his eye, still maintaining a sense of disguise. "I will take it to Nikolai. Perhaps he knows who it belongs to." The man bent forward to zip up the flaps and caught a flash of movement. Sean slid the black knife's edge across the man's throat, cutting deeply into his flesh. The Russian gasped and fell backward onto his tailbone, grabbing at the wide gash as it gushed blood through his fingers and onto the muddy ground. Sean slung a leg over the man's torso, and with the weight of his leg and the force of his hand, shoved the dying man into a puddle face first until his struggle against death was lost. Someone would notice that guy's absence before too long, as if Sean didn't already need to work faster. He zipped up the bag, grabbed the flashlight, and sauntered away from the pallet stack toward a metal shipping container on the broadside of both moving vans. He panned the flashlight slowly around the grounds, shining it up toward a stack of containers as if he were one of the patrol guards. Again, the ruse worked, and none of the loading workers seemed to pay any attention to him. Once on the backside of the shipping container, Sean knelt down, placed the pack at his feet, and grabbed the first of the 2 grenades. Everything would have to be timed perfectly. A quick scan over his shoulder to make sure no one was behind him, and he was ready. Sean pulled the pin on the first grenade, leaned out from behind the container, and launched it at a low trajectory toward the first van. He rapidly repeated the process for the second ordnance and rolled it hard across the loading area. He tucked back behind the steel container and waited, counting in his mind until he heard the first blast. 2 heartbeats later, he heard the second explosion. Another larger boom rocked the entire shipping yard, shaking the ground like heavy thunder. Shouts from panic-stricken men filled the air. The voice of one man screaming in pain shrieked through the night. Sean dipped into the pack and removed a flashbang. He peeked around the corner of the container and saw that the first grenade had done massive damage to the front van, but the second truck had only lost tires and displayed minimal cosmetic damage to the side. Still, both trucks were disabled, and the first one had caught on fire, sending black smoke up into the rainy night. 2 men rolled around behind the second truck. A third didn't move at all. Sean lobbed the first of the flashbangs toward the scrambling crowd of men who were confusedly trying to reorganize into a defensive position with submachine guns brandished and waving in all directions. The flashbang landed at the feet of a cluster of gunmen. A second later, a searing white light flashed through the loading area, burning the vision of everyone in the group. Sean stepped out from his hiding spot and raised his rifle. He fired mercilessly at the blinded men, picking them off with well-placed shots as he unloaded the contents of his magazine into the group. The Russian mobsters fell like insects to bug spray. Some managed to fire a few shots randomly into the air, but no one came close to hitting the man taking their lives from them. All told, Sean eliminated a dozen men within 20 seconds. The rest, realizing they'd been caught by surprise, had retreated to the stronghold of the warehouse, taking up positions within the building. It was easy to see the ones who chose windows to shoot from. 2 huddled behind concrete barriers just outside the door. "Nat!" A gunman appeared around the front of the second van and raised a pistol. The man's leg was bleeding badly, blackened from the explosion and pierced with shrapnel. Sean caught the movement out of his left eye and twitched to the side, squeezed the trigger, and sent a round through the man's heart. As the gunman fell backward into the wet gravel, he managed one random shot into the black sky before he died. Sean returned his focus to the main building where the rest of the gunmen held out. He scooped up his bag on the run and sprinted behind a steel shipping container with Russian lettering on the side. Bullets pinged off the dense metal as the enemy finally managed to put together a cohesive attack. The rattle of gunfire sounded strange in the night, echoing through the rain and dampened by the overcast sky above. Then, as suddenly as it began, the barrage stopped. Sean knew what was coming next. The enemy would either emerge from their fortress and flank both sides of the container, or they would lob some explosives to his side and try to blow him out from behind it. Uncertain Pushnaya's men had those kinds of weapons. Sean planned on the first line of attack. He dipped his left hand into his bag and removed a small, olive-green satchel. He placed the little bag on the gravel and flipped a switch on the side of a panel inside it. Then, keeping his line straight, he ran directly away from the shipping container, sprinting for another pair of stacks 20 yards away. He didn't risk looking back until he slid along the gravel, skidding to a stop to slide around the corner of the first 2 containers. Sean took a knee on the wet ground and aimed through the scope at the place where he'd been before. He saw the satchel still there, but no sign of enemy gunmen. The window at the top of the warehouse was in view, though, and Sean saw someone moving frantically inside. If he wasn't mistaken, he'd have sworn it looked like someone hurrying to collect their things to make their escape. Pushnaya, Sean realized. He couldn't let the man get away, but he also couldn't make a hard push to the building until the path was clear. Sean knew he had the option to go around to the back side, which was probably the best move, but he needed to thin the herd. With probably half of the gunrunner's forces eliminated, Sean knew he was rapidly gaining the advantage, even though he was still outnumbered. He breathed calmly, forcing himself to remain patient just as he'd learned during his training, and as he'd practiced when under duress throughout life. "Let them come to you," Sean whispered. Rain dripped off of the suppressor at the end of his barrel. More rain dribbled around his eyes and down his cheeks. He didn't let it affect him, remaining focused on the satchel and both ends of the shipping container 20 yards away. Then, as he figured, 2 groups of 3 men each appeared abruptly on either end. They rushed around the container's edges with submachine guns raised, ready to cut down the attacker. Instead, they found nothing but gravel and a small satchel. 2 of the men swiveled around, scouring the yard for the magician who'd simply vanished. The other 4 closed in on the satchel. Sean flipped up a flap on one of the utility pockets on his belt. Then he pried open the plastic button cover and held his thumb over it, waiting while the 4 men neared the satchel. It would be nice if the other 2 were closer, but 4 would be enough. When the curious gunmen were within 2 yards of the oddly placed bag, Sean pressed the button. He winced as the explosion rumbled the ground underfoot and consumed the 4 men in a ball of orange fire. The other 2 were thrown off their feet, sent sprawling through the air. One struck a pile of pallets and landed on the ground. The other wasn't so lucky. He flew 20 feet through the air and landed on a spike of rebar that jutted from a K-rail, impaling him through the chest. He kicked his feet for several seconds. Then the kicking slowed until it stopped with his death. Sean aimed at the first man, who struggled to get to his feet. One shot through the top of the gunman's skull sent him back down to the gravel for good. Most of Pushnaya's forces had been decimated in minutes, but Sean knew the hardest part still waited for him. He looked up to the office window again and found no movement. The boss was gone, at least from that part of the facility. If Sean didn't act quickly, Pushnaya would escape, and there might not be another chance like this to get him. 1 minute, Vladimir Pushnaya and Nikolai were sipping vodka, while 4 of their men ran millions of euros through money-counting machines. The next minute, they were drinking from the chalice of chaos. They'd been halfway done with the process when the first explosion shook them from their seats. Then came another. Then larger explosions rocked the foundation of the old warehouse and rattled the windows. Pushnaya had risked a look out the window against the recommendations of Nikolai. He saw nothing, save for some of his men dead on the ground, while the survivors scrambled to take up defensive positions. "What is happening?" Pushnaya roared as the gunfight raged down in the yard below. He scrambled to collect his things while Nikolai, his second-in-command, stuffed duffel bags with cash. "We're under attack," Nikolai answered. "We must escape." "Attack?" Pushnaya asked. "From who? Who would dare? Who would even know?" His answer came with the sound of more gunfire, then silence. Pushnaya listened intently. Nikolai did the same. The boss waved his hand toward the money counters, urging them to work faster as they hurriedly stashed bills into bags. "Don't worry about counting it now. Take all you can." The bulbous Russian looked toward the window again, unwilling to get in the open in case the attackers felt like taking a crack at him. For all Pushnaya knew, there could be snipers outside with their scopes lined up on the window, just waiting for him to make a mistake. He briefly considered ordering one of his men into the middle of the room to collect some random object, just to see if a bullet would streak through and strike the man, but Pushnaya decided against it. The sacrifice would prove nothing other than his assumptions, and to get out of this alive, the big Russian had the feeling he was going to need all the help he could get. Pushnaya's eyelids narrowed to slits as he continued to listen. The gun battle had faded to the eerie silence of a rainy night. Heavy raindrops pattered on the metal roof above. The counters also paused, as it seemed the earth itself waited for something to happen. "Don't stop," the boss ordered, whipping his hands around in circles. The money counters nodded and returned to their task, shoveling stacks of euros into black bags. Then another explosion shook the building and sent the men in the office diving for cover. The rickety glass in the window rattled nearly to the point of breaking. "That's it!" Pushnaya called out. "Get what we have and move!" "But sir," one of the counters protested, pointing at a stack of bills on a folding table in the middle of the room. "I said leave it," Pushnaya ordered. Anger raged in his voice. "You two, take point." He motioned to the 2 nearest the door. They stood with 2 bags each slung over their shoulders. "Nikolai, lead them out." Then he looked at the other 2 money counters. "You two follow me. The men nodded and hefted the bags over their shoulders. Each of the carriers was also equipped with submachine guns with their right hands looped through the duffel bag straps so they could prop the weapons near their hips. They wouldn't be accurate if it came to shooting their way out, but the 4 men, plus Nikolai, could at the very least lay down covering fire while Pushnaya made his escape. He didn't want to leave money on the table, but he had no choice. There was plenty already in the bags, but even then he knew that survival was paramount. He could, after all, always make more money. Nikolai opened the door and swung out onto the landing, his AR-15 braced against his shoulder. He swept the warehouse with a passing eye, surveying the huge open space. Through the metal grate of the catwalk, he saw 2 of his men positioned on either side of the door, leading out into the shipping yard. 2 others lurked behind concrete barriers 20 feet inside. Behind their position, 4 black Range Rovers and 2 more moving vans sat parked in the middle of the building. Nikolai took a glance over at the massive sliding doors across from the vehicles. They would have to reach those doors and get them open before making their escape. He just hoped the 4 men guarding the entrance could cover them long enough. Without knowing what kind of numbers they were up against, it was a gamble. Moving quickly and stealthily down the steps, Nikolai kept his weapon ready, sweeping back and forth in case they were flanked. He arrived at the second landing and held up his left fist for the men behind him to halt. The men carrying the bag stopped, as did Pushnaya as he gripped his showy Desert Eagle .45 with nervous fingers. After listening and watching for a long breath, Nikolai pointed forward and continued down the steps. When the group reached the ground floor, Nikolai took up a position between his charge and the open doorway and motioned for the group to head to the nearest SUV. The first 2 money counters scurried around the concrete barriers, where 2 of the gunmen still waited, watching the entrance. The men with the duffel bags opened the back door to the Range Rover and tossed the bags into the rear cargo area. "You 2! Over there in that one!" Pushnaya barked at the 2 men behind him. They only puzzled at the request for a second before obeying. "As my mother once said, never put all your eggs into one basket, eh?" Pushnaya commented to Nikolai. The bodyguard only acknowledged the statement with the briefest of nods as he kept his weapon aimed at the opening, waiting for an attack at any second. "You 2! Pushnaya snapped again, pointing to the first 2 couriers who were about to climb into the front seat of the first SUV. "Open the bay doors." The men looked uncertainty at each other, then rushed across the floor to the enormous doors. One loosed a chain from a metal hook beside the gigantic doorframe, and then joined the other who held onto a handle, pulling at the sliding door. The second man pushed, and the rusty wheels squeaked along the rails above as the hanging door rolled to the right. The door was halfway open when Pushnaya shouted for them to return to their vehicle. The boss climbed into the passenger seat of the first vehicle with Nikolai already behind the wheel. The other 2 men waited in the second SUV. The men who opened the door began running back across the floor to the convoy when a barrage of muted gunfire popped from the wide opening. Bullets struck the men in the back and dropped them to the ground in mid-stride with arms flailing as they fell prostrate. Pushnaya slammed his door shut. "Drive!" he ordered Nikolai. Then he turned and waved at the 2 other men in the second SUV to take the lead. The gunman in the passenger side leaned out the window with his submachine gun and squeezed the trigger 5 times to lay down covering fire. The men guarding the front door spun around at the sounds of gunfire coming from the rear. All of them exposed, they scattered like cockroaches in daylight, diving for shadows or cover. Nikolai waited for the other Range Rover to speed up in front. The driver stepped on the gas and the SUV's tires spun on the pavement, kicking debris out behind them. The vehicle surged forward in front of Pushnaya's ride, hurtling toward the opening. From the shadows behind the sliding door, Pushnaya saw a ghostly figure in black and gray merge with the darkness. The light from the warehouse barely touched the apparition. "There!" Pushnaya shouted as Nikolai stepped on the accelerator and launched the SUV forward behind the first. The attacker fired several shots at the oncoming lead vehicle, peppering it with bullets. Pushnaya couldn't see through the darkly tinted back windows, but he didn't need to in order to know what happened. The SUV abruptly swerved right and slammed into the corner post where the sliding door ended. The gunman in the passenger seat flew into the windshield. Glass and metal crunched. Broken plastic flew through the air. Pushnaya's men in the warehouse opened fire, unleashing their return volley in dangerous proximity to the boss's escape vehicle. The cover fire was enough, though, and Pushnaya didn't see the attacker until they were through the open doorway and out into the rain. He looked back and saw a muzzle flash multiple times. The back window shattered, and Pushnaya ducked instinctively for cover. Bullets ripped through the leather seats in the back. One struck Nikolai in the shoulder, but the hardened warrior didn't let it divert his focus. He remained concentrated on the exit as the SUV accelerated away from the warehouse. Pushnaya, confident they were too far away from the gunman, relaxed and looked back through the missing rear window. The attacker's muzzle flashed once. Pushnaya heard the bullet zip through the air inches away from his face. It punctured the windshield and sent the man scrambling down in his seat. He swallowed, momentarily relieved. Up ahead, he saw the two gate guards hurrying to open the rolling barricade. Out of the corner of his eye, Pushnaya caught movement and turned in time to see a flatbed truck rumbling toward them. "Look out!" the boss shouted, but it was too late. Nikolai winced against the pain radiating from his shoulder as he tried to turn the wheel sharply to avoid the oncoming truck. His effort was in vain. The driver of the flatbed guided the nose of the heavy vehicle straight at the SUV. Pushnaya noted the 2 brief seconds of eerie, helpless silence that passed by in slow motion just before the flatbed truck collided with the Range Rover. The front left quarter panel of the big truck smashed into the SUV's right side, obliterating the right front tire and caving in the hood and fender. Smoke immediately billowed from the ruptured hoses and cracked engine block as the big truck plowed ahead, flipping the SUV over onto its side. The guards at the gate watched in rapt horror for several seconds until they managed to recover and raise their weapons. The 2 men fired haplessly at the flatbed, missing the cab with nearly every shot. The driver of the truck kept the gas pedal to the floor. Sparks flashed brightly from the driver's side of the Range Rover as it scraped along the gravel and asphalt. Pushnaya grimaced in pain, lying on top of Nikolai, who screamed like a banshee in a rainstorm. His left arm hung limp near the window, severed from the elbow down. Before he could do anything to brace himself, Pushnaya saw a stack of steel shipping containers through the moonroof and knew the truck driver's intention. He braced himself against the dashboard and yelled in terror a second before the roof of the SUV crunched into the bottom container of the stack in a crash of metal and glass. Sean knew his shot missed the mark. The target shrank out of view in his scope as the bullet whizzed by Pushnaya's head. The big flatbed truck, however, could not be avoided. Sean watched as the heavy vehicle drilled the front end of the SUV, flipped it onto its side, and barreled across the loading yard until it smashed into a stack of shipping containers. The steel box on top of the stack wobbled, and for a second Sean thought it might topple over, but it held in place, due only to the fact that the SUV struck the end instead of the broadside. Smoke and steam billowed from the hood of the big truck. More escaped the mangled SUV, and Sean wondered if the vehicle might ignite. He also spent 2 seconds concerned about the driver of the flatbed. "That was perfect timing," Sean said into his radio. A female voice answered. "Ugh, good thing I wore my seatbelt. I didn't think it was going to be that jarring. Next time you drive the ambush truck." "Hey, this whole partner thing is a first for Axis from what I understand. Who knows if they do it again. Now, if you don't mind, I need to clean up in the warehouse. Don't let Pushnaya get away." Gunfire from the gate echoed his concerns. "May want to handle those 2 first." "On it," the woman said. Sean saw the driver's side door open to the big truck. An athletic figure clad in tight black tactical gear hopped down, her face covered with a mask that only revealed her eyes. The woman moved with the lethal grace of a prowling panther, scanning the area for the best route to her quarry. Sean spun away from Agent Starks as she slipped around the halted flatbed, stalking the 2 men who'd left their post at the gate to pursue the driver of the truck. Inside the warehouse, Sean knew there were still several gunmen. 2 were dead, that much he could figure, but there were 2 by the door and 2 more near barricades when he'd sprung the trap. A quick peek inside revealed those targets were, as he already knew, no longer in their previous positions. Steam hissed and spewed out of the wrecked SUV at the corner of the hanging door. Coolant and transmission fluid dripped from fractures in the radiator and transmission case, mixing into a dark, obscure color on the ground. Sean crept up next to the driver's door and stole a look inside. The two henchmen didn't move. One had a bloody patch on the back of his skull where he hit the windshield. The other remained slumped over with his head resting just over the left shoulder. Bullet holes oozed blood from his neck, chest, and forehead. Based on the amount of crimson pooling in the passenger floorboard, Sean knew some of the rounds had hit the other guy as well. He ejected the magazine from his weapon and replaced it before sliding along the side of the SUV to the rear end. To his right, a gunman popped up from behind a concrete barrier and fired. Where he stood, Sean was a sitting duck, but the shooter only managed 3 misplaced shots before Sean replied with a series of his own. The bullets pounded the concrete blockade and sent the man sprawling for cover again. That's one of them, Sean thought. Uncertain where the others might be hiding, he decided to do as he'd been trained and address the known threat first. He sprinted from his position and ducked behind a stack of dusty pallets. From there, he had the shooter flanked, but there was no way to know if he had also been flanked. Sean's eyes danced around the building as he crept around the edge of the wooden shelter. The gunman hadn't seen Sean's move and still crouched behind the barrier. Sean watched as the man popped up and took aim, thinking his quarry might still be where he'd last seen him. Sean lined up his sights and squeezed the trigger twice. The bullets lodged in the man's torso, just under the armpit. The gunman fell over on his side, writhed for half a minute, then lay still. More gunshots opened from across the facility. 2 shooters fired in Sean's direction, but the men were too far away for their short-range weapons to be effective. Sean ducked back behind the pallets and waited for the men to cease fire and replace their magazines. More gunfire came from a third angle, this one closer to the door on the other side of the warehouse. Bullets pinged off the metal walls and thumped into concrete. The shots might have been inaccurate, but a blind squirrel gets a nut now and then, and Sean didn't want to be the nut. He was pinned down, and with Emily handling business outside, Sean had to figure out a way to take out the 3 enemies without giving them a clean shot. To his right, between him and the newly dead gunman, a forklift sat pointed directly at the 2 men on the far side of the warehouse. Upon closer inspection, Sean also noted the propane tanks on the backside of the machine. An idea popped into Sean's mind, and without thinking twice, he sprang from cover and darted over to the forklift. More bullets snapped at the surrounding air. Some ricocheted off of steel or concrete. He took 3 seconds to catch his breath, then crawled around to the front of the machine and checked inside. Sean worried momentarily that he'd have to figure out how to hotwire the thing, but that concern vanished when he saw the keys dangling in the ignition. He turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. The gunman opened fire again. Sean used the forklift for cover, raising the front loader with a lever on the left. The shooter on his right side was blocked by the machine's body. With no time to make sure the thing was aimed perfectly, Sean shifted the forklift into gear and watched as it rumbled forward across the empty warehouse floor. He ducked behind another concrete barrier and watched the gunman targeting the machine, which they apparently believed he was operating despite no visual sign of him on board. Gunfire popped rampantly. Sparks flew off the forklift's metal body. It narrowly missed the remaining Range Rovers parked near the front door and skimmed by one of the dead men Sean had eliminated earlier. Sean raised his rifle and lined up the fuel tank. His finger tensed on the trigger. He waited until the forklift was within range of the 2 men farthest from him. When it was between them both, Sean squeezed the trigger. The bullet sparked off of the yellow steel frame near the propane tank. He took a deep breath and squeezed again. The second round deflected off of a roll bar just beneath the tank. With a sigh, Sean tightened his grip and steadied his breathing. He was only going to get one more shot at this, and if he missed, taking out the 3 gunmen would be much tougher. He held his breath, then released as his finger pulled back on the trigger. A bright orange-yellow flame exploded from the forklift. The sphere of fire expanded in an instant, consuming the 2 gunmen. The concussion rocked the entire building down to its foundation. The floor shook under Sean for a second and then was still once more. Sean knew the 3rd gunman to his right was probably unaffected by the blast, except for causing the man to duck for cover. Sean stood from his shelter and hurried around the wall of K-rails toward the front entrance. He found the gunman crouching behind a stack of sheet metal. The man saw Sean too late and caught 4 rounds to the chest. He slumped against the stack and over onto his side. Finally, the flurry of activity caught up to Sean, and he breathed heavily for a minute. Then he realized Emily was still outside dealing with the guards. She was every bit the agent as him, but there'd always been something deep inside him that felt the need to help. It wasn't a savior complex. At least that's what he told himself. But no matter the situation, Sean had trouble sitting on the sidelines for anything. He hurried out the door and into the spitting Moldovan rain and skidded to a stop. Looking to his left, Sean found Emily standing out in the open near the gate. She stood between 2 bodies, one at either side of the entrance, a pistol in her hand. Sean breathed easier and walked toward her. Emily holstered her weapon and sauntered away from the gate, meeting Sean halfway across the span of the lot. When the two met, she lowered her mask and grinned. Her dark brown hair dangled freely off of her shoulders, catching the rain. "Perfect timing, Agent Starks," Sean said with an affirming nod. She looked around at the shipping yard for a few seconds and then returned his gesture. "Efficient. Clean. I'd say we did all right for the first tandem mission. The director and the president should be pleased." "Yes." There was a coolness to her voice, an absence of emotion that sent a chill through Sean's spine. He was about to suggest they steal one of the Range Rovers and get out of there when he saw something shift over her shoulder 20 yards away, where the flatbed truck pinned Pushnaya's ride against a shipping container. Sean only had enough time to make one move as Pushnaya emerged from the SUV's shattered back window. Sean abruptly reached out, grabbed Emily by the shoulders, and shoved her to the ground. Pushnaya extended the long pistol barrel and fired. Sean dove to the right, twisting in the air to raise his rifle before he hit the wet ground. The impact jarred him and jammed the gun's stock into his ribs. He rolled to the right even as Pushnaya continued firing at will, with one thunderous boom after another. Bullets splashed in puddles and exploded chunks of wet pavement around Sean. He rolled over again, watching the dazed Russian fire his weapon. The recoil was too much for the man to handle, and every shot sent his gun hand up several inches, almost to his face. Another round flashed from the muzzle, and Sean felt debris rain onto his face. He settled on his belly and lined up the sight with Pushnaya's face. The Russian's pistol lowered. The big man bled from a gash on the side of his head and cuts on his cheeks. He glowered at Sean as he tried to aim the sights at his target. Sean's finger tightened on the trigger, and he squeezed. The last look on Pushnaya's face was one of grim resignation, realizing that he was a dead man. He managed to fire a shot, but his aim was high and the bullet sailed into the rainy night. Sean's round, however, zipped through the target just below Pushnaya's left eye. The big man slumped forward onto his face and lay motionless. Sean breathed heavily for several seconds, keeping his focus on the target in case the man got up, which he quickly realized was beyond paranoid. He scrambled to his feet and glanced over at Emily, who had drawn her weapon again and held it pointed toward Pushnaya's SUV. Upon seeing the exit wound, she lowered her pistol but kept it ready in case of any other surprises. "You okay?" Sean asked, stopping a few feet to her right. "Yeah," she said with a nod, but her voice betrayed a hint of shakiness. "I'm good. Guess we should be more careful." "Yes, careful would be good." Sean took a few steps closer to the SUV and looked inside. Pushnaya's driver's head was twisted at an impossible angle, his neck broken. "Well, he's definitely not getting up again," Sean stated. He looked back at the warehouse. "As I was about to say a minute ago, let's get out of here. Call the director." "On it." She took out a cell phone and pressed a button. The speed dial connected her after some crackling. It rang one time before a gruff voice answered. "Go ahead, operator." "Confirm code badger." "Confirmed. Status?" "Complete, sir." "Thank you, operator." "Yes, sir. Leaving now." She ended the call and stuffed it into a pocket. She would destroy the device and drop it in a river at the first bridge they crossed. Sean led the way back into the warehouse to one of the remaining, undamaged SUVs and opened the door to the driver's side. He was about to step in when Emily beat him to it, slipping in just in front of him. "Polite for you to hold the door for a lady," she said coyly. He offered a defeated smirk in reply. "Didn't know you wanted to drive," he said. "Fine by me." He shut the door when she was comfortably in the seat and made his way round the front. When he'd settled in the passenger seat, she revved the engine. "Where's your drop-off?" she asked. "Not far from here," he answered. Emily looked pensive for 10 seconds before turning to face him. "Thanks again, partner," she managed. Sean disarmed her with a wry grin. "Whoa, easy. We don't know if this is a one-time thing or what." She chuckled. "I have a feeling we'll be doing this more often than not." Thank you for listening to The Moldova Job by Ernest Dempsey. If you'd like to discover more action, mystery, and more adventure, click the link in the description to pick up a copy of his latest Sean Wyatt novel on Amazon. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss new, exclusive YouTube content when it drops.